Alien Beastwoman Gladiator pins me daily and calls it train. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Brody's boots hit the sand with a thud that echoed louder in his chest than across the arena. The crowd roared above, an unending wave of alien cheers, guttural howls, and tribal drums. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what stood before him. Towering, broad-shouldered, and draped in torn crimson wraps, Hilda, the undefeated Beastwoman Champion, stalked toward him with a smirk that exposed two sharp fangs and a fire in her glowing orange eyes that made it hard to look away. Her reddish fur shimmered under the twin suns, and every step she took left a deep impression in the sand like a war god descending. Brody had faced machines back on Earth, survived orbital drops, outsmarted drones, but this was survival stripped down to muscle, instinct, and dirt. He had expected a weapon, maybe even a few seconds to strategize, but Hilda tossed her axe aside without a glance, claws flexing with anticipation. "You're not worth steel. Show me what you've got, soft skin," she growled, voiced gravelly and rich like a fire cracking under stone. Brody steadied himself. He wasn't here by choice. Political prisoner, they called him. Earth's latest ambassador failure traded as entertainment to appease some treaty. He'd only been in the Colosseum for 2 days and already lost 2 sparring partners. Now they threw him to her, the apex predator with a fan base that would riot if she didn't break at least 1 bone per match, but she didn't charge. Not yet. She tilted her head like a cat watching a toy figure out its doomed. It gave Brody a few seconds to assess, not just her, but the patterns. She favored her left side. That horn curved inward slightly, maybe an old break. Her right leg shifted slower in the sand. Minor limp, perhaps. He could use that. He moved first a feint to the left, and then a real dive to the right, hopping to catch her off balance. But she was already there, her hand catching his collar like he was a misbehaving pup. He didn't even hit the ground. She brought him down gently yet firmly, her thigh landing across his waist with full weight as her palm pressed his chest flat into the sand. She didn't speak for a moment. Then that same grin returned. "You're quick, but not quicker than me." She leaned closer, her voice a whisper against his ear. "You're learning already." Humiliation burned in his chest, but not anger. There was no mockery in her tone, just curiosity. The crowd exploded in cheers, but Hilda didn't lift her arms in triumph. Instead, she stood and offered a hand. He hesitated, then took it. Her grip was firm, rough, but careful not to crush. As she pulled him up, she eyed him the way one studies a tool testing its limits. "I told the overseers not to waste you. You're not like the last ones." Brody dusted himself off. "Thanks, I guess." "You want to live through this place?" she asked bluntly. "Then fight me every day until you can stand your ground. I'll train you, not out of mercy. I just want to challenge again." She leaned close, her horns almost touching his forehead. "And you're mine now. That means I get to break you improperly." That night, Brody sat in the Gladiator quarters, his back sore but his pride oddly intact. The other fighters, some with gills, others with insect limbs or metallic implants, avoided him. He was still the outsider, the soft-skinned human with nothing but nerves and a borrowed uniform, but he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she pinned him without hate, about how she didn't mock him or throw him aside. There was method in her madness. She could have killed him, crushed his windpipe or thrown him into the wall like the others, but she didn't. She was toying with him, yes, but also teaching. She wanted him to survive. That alone made her dangerous. The next day she met him in the training ring before dawn. No audience, just 2 bodies in the sand. She didn't speak. She simply moved fast and fluid, claws gleaming in the low light, challenging him with each shift of her weight. He countered twice before she knocked him flat again, her body pressing down in that same way. She smiled wider this time, her tail swishing lazily behind her. "You hesitated. Don't do that again." He grunted. I was calculating your momentum. Cute. Try punching me next time instead. Over the next hour, she threw him dozens of times. Each time she helped him up. Sometimes she gave him tips. Other times she laughed and rolled her shoulder like she hadn't even broken a sweat. When they paused for water, she sat beside him like they were comrades instead of predator and prey. Her presence was overwhelming. Her thighs were streaked with old scars, her fur matted with dust, but her eyes never lost that feral glow. He asked her once why she kept sparring him. She looked up at the sky for a long moment, then said, "Because every beast needs something worth protecting. Maybe you'll be it, or maybe I'll break you before I find out." Brody didn't know what to say to that, but he didn't look away. Something had shifted between them, something unspoken but growing. Not romance, not yet, but a tension built on instinct, proximity, and the raw necessity of survival. She didn't coddle him, she didn't flirt, but there was a closeness that formed in the dirt under heat and sweat under bruises and breathless standoffs. Hilda saw him as more than a toy now, maybe a partner, maybe not yet an equal, but something on the path to it. That night, as Brody lay on his bunk, ribs sore and muscles aching, he stared at the stone ceiling and let his mind drift. The Colosseum might be hell, but it was honest. Pain made things clear. Fear sharpened the mind. And in the middle of it all was her, this towering, dangerous, wild creature, who could have killed him a dozen times, but instead chose to teach him, chose to keep him breathing, chose to speak to him like he mattered. He wasn't just surviving, he was becoming something else, something that could stand beside her in the arena, not behind her. And when she whispered, "You're learning well," he believed her, because deep down, despite everything, he wanted to. The next morning came with a heat that clung to every surface, soaking into the bones and muscles Brody hadn't even known he had. The stone walls of the arena steamed under the twin suns, and the sand felt hotter than usual under his boots as he stepped into the training ring. He wasn't alone for long. Hilda emerged from one of the side tunnels without ceremony, her presence commanding even without an audience. Her reddish fur gleamed with sweat already, and the shadows cast by her jagged horns gave her a silhouette that looked carved from war itself. She didn't bother with a greeting, just walked past him, rolled her shoulders, and cracked her neck with a sound that made something deep in his chest tight. Then she turned, looked at him with that same half-smile and said, "We start now. Today you learn pain, real pain, not the kind that makes you cry, but the kind that teaches." Brody didn't answer. He simply nodded and adjusted his stance, bracing his legs. His pride had recovered a little from yesterday. He still ached in at least 6 different spots, but it was a productive ache, the kind that meant he was still breathing, still standing, and more importantly, he was still here. The first blow came fast. Hilda didn't announce it, didn't warn him. She moved like a storm, one arm slamming into his defense and knocking him flat again. But this time he rolled with the impact instead of absorbing it. He used the momentum to spring back to his feet before she could pin him, and the way her eyebrow lifted slightly said she noticed. She circled him now, not like a teacher, but like a predator sensing a change in her prey's scent. "Better," she muttered, still slow. He lunged, aiming for her left knee. He remembered the limp, however slight, but she spun around it and caught his side with her elbow. He hit the sand again, tasted grit, but shoved himself up before her shadow could loom too long. "You're baiting me," he said through clenched teeth, "making me go for your weak spots just so you can count her." "That's what weakness is for," she growled, packing. "Not every flaw is real. Some are invitations, and if you accept the wrong one, you die." They went again and again. Blow after blow, grapple after grapple. Sometimes she let him land a hit, sometimes she punished him for it, but with every fall, every slam into the hot sand, Brody felt something shift. His body was adjusting. He was no longer flailing, he was fighting. He even managed to flip her once using her own momentum against her. She landed hard but laughed when she hit the ground. That laughter, deep and feral and full of surprise, sent a jolt of pride through him. She stood without anger and brushed sand off her thigh with a look that wasn't just amused. It was impressed. "You're not useless," she said at last. "You still move like prey, but at least you bite back now." She walked to the edge of the ring, grabbed a water gourd and took a long swig before tossing it to him. "Drink. Then I show you how to break a spine without breaking your fingers." Brody caught the gourd, sat in the sand with a grunt, and tilted his head up to drink. The water was warm and metallic, but it did the job. Hilda sat beside him, legs stretched out, claws tracing idle lines in the dirt. She didn't speak for a while. When she did, her voice was quieter. "You know why I train you. Why don't just break you and move on?" "I figured it's because I amuse you," Brody said, glancing at her. "And you like having someone to pin." She chuckled, but it didn't carry the same mocking tone as before. "Partly, but no. I do it because I see something. Your kind pretends it's soft, polished, clean, diplomatic. But under all that tech and pride, there's something raw, something hungry. You want to survive more than most of the grubs that come through here. You want to matter. I understand that." He didn't know how to respond to that. There was something brutally honest in her words, and hearing it out loud felt like someone stripping away layers of armor. He nodded slowly, staring at the ground. "I used to fix machines, build things. Now I get tossed in a pit to be pummeled. I guess I'm learning how to rebuild myself, too." Hilda's gaze lingered on him. Unreadable. "That's the first true thing you've said." They sparred again before sundown. This time the rhythm changed. Less punishment, more challenge. She wasn't holding back, but she wasn't just dominating him either. She adjusted to his pace, forced him to think 3 moves ahead to use his brain instead of just flailing. Her body moved like a weapon forged for battle, every movement efficient, every strike deliberate. Yet now there was a rhythm to it, a give and take. Their grunts echoed off the stone walls as their limbs collided, feet shuffling through the sand in a dance that felt more like a duel of equals than teacher and student. Eventually he tripped. It wasn't a hard fall, but Hilda was on him instantly, pinning him down again. Her thighs clamped around his waist, claws pressing lightly against his arms. He met her gaze, chest heaving, and saw something different there. The amusement remained, but behind it flickered something warmer, something dangerous. She didn't smirk. She just breathed, steady and calm, her face inches from his. "You're improving. That's good. I was beginning to worry I'd have to get another trainee." Brody raised a brow, still pinned beneath her, "And miss out on throwing me around like a toy." She tilted her head slightly. "You're not a toy anymore. You're mine now. That's different." She released him slowly, rolling off with a casual grace that only made his heart pound harder. He sat up, wiping sweat from his forehead. He didn't trust himself to speak, not yet. Whatever this was, this tension, this strange bond forming in the heat and grit and pain, it wasn't a game. It was real. Unspoken, maybe, but real. That night he found himself staring at the stars through the iron bars of his sleeping chamber, thinking not of Earth, not of escape, but of her voice, rough and smoky, of her laugh, of the way she pinned him with more tenderness than violence. Something was changing inside him, something he couldn't quite name, but he didn't resist it. And tomorrow he would meet her in the sand again, not to survive, but to fight, to learn, to grow. And maybe, just maybe, to get close enough to make her stop holding back. The 3rd week brought with it a shift Brody hadn't anticipated, not just in the way his body responded to Hilda's strikes, or how his footwork began matching her tempo, but in how the Colosseum itself seemed to be watching. He noticed it during a break in one of their training sessions. The crowd wasn't present, but there were eyes, guards pausing longer at the gate, arena handlers whispering behind their clawed hands, even a drone hovering too steadily near the top arches. Its red lens focused not just on Hilda, but on him. Brody didn't comment, but Hilda noticed too. She stood with her arms folded, her broad shoulders rising and falling with her slow breaths, gaze locked on the drone until it veered off. When she turned back to him, her tone was different, lower. "You're drawing attention, the wrong kind." Brody ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair, breathing hard. Because I'm surviving. That's a problem now. It's not just that you're surviving. You're surviving with me, she replied, stepping closer. Her fur was streaked with dust and blood from the earlier spar, her glowing eyes narrowed. No other human has lasted this long, and none of them earned my favor. Her words landed with a strange weight. Brody looked up at her and asked the question that had been gnawing at him since their first match. Why do you really care? What makes me different from the others you've seen die in this place? Hilda didn't answer right away. She turned, grabbed a battered spear from the rack and hurled it across the training pit without warning. It struck the far wall with a deafening clang, the shaft splintering on impact. When she faced him again, her voice had dropped even lower. Because you remind me of someone I lost, someone who kept fighting when everything told her to quit, someone I let die because I didn't trust her strength. Brody didn't press. He let the silence linger, watching the way her hands tightened into fists at her sides, the way her jaw clenched as if holding back more than words. It wasn't weakness. It was memory, pain buried beneath layers of victories and scars. In that moment, he understood something deeper. Hilda wasn't just training him to be stronger, she was training him to avoid the fate of someone she'd once failed to protect. That evening, the arena thundered with activity. A special match had been announced, one of the blood tournaments meant to entertain the Varku nobles. Brody hadn't been scheduled to fight, but Hilda was. He stood in the shadows of the stone corridors, watching her prepare. She stood tall, armored only in what little ceremonial gear her tribe's tradition allowed. Her weapons gleamed under the firelight, but she looked calm, almost detached. Before stepping into the ring, she turned to him. Watch carefully. This isn't training. This is how monsters move when they're forced to perform. She entered the Colosseum to a deafening roar. The air pulsed with chants and tribal drums. Her opponent was a beast twice her size, wrapped in chains and scars, its face half covered by a metal plate and breathing tubes. A war golem from the outer moons, barely sentient, bred only for carnage. Brody watched as Hilda circled the monster, never hesitating, never flinching. She didn't fight it head-on. Instead, she used her agility, baited its wide swings, and punished every mistake. When she finally brought it down, driving her knee into its chest and snapping its spine with a roar, the crowd exploded in ecstasy. But Brody saw something different in her stance. In her eyes, she didn't celebrate. She didn't lift her arms in victory. She looked up at the nobles in the high seats and spat in their direction. That night, she returned to the quarters bruised and quieter than usual. Brody approached her carefully, unsure if she wanted company. She was sitting against the wall, tail curled around her leg, nursing a cut on her shoulder. He knelt beside her and took the cloth from her hand, pressing it gently to her wound. She didn't stop him. I saw the way you looked at them, he said quietly, like you wanted to tear them apart. She chuckled without humor. That's because I do, but I can't not yet. This place is rigged to keep us chained through glory. When enough, they say you earn freedom, but the truth is no one leaves unless they're forgotten or dead. Brody swallowed the lump forming in his throat. Then why do you keep fighting? Because if I stop, they punish my people, she replied, her eyes hardening. Every wind means food, medicine, weapons for my tribe hiding in the wastes. Every fight I survive is one more day they live. That's the deal. It was a cruel bargain. Strength for scraps, survival at the cost of constant bloodshed, but Brody began to see the bigger picture. Hilda wasn't just a warrior. She was a provider, a protector, a living symbol for people relying on her strength to exist. Everything she did, from the way she trained him to the way she fought, was part of something larger, and now he was part of it too. Over the next few days, he noticed the change in how others treated him. Some of the lesser fighters began to nod when he passed. A few whispered greetings in broken trade tongue. One even offered him dried meat from their rations. They were subtle gestures, but in this place it was a form of alliance. He wasn't just Hilda's plaything anymore. He was becoming something else, a symbol perhaps, or at least a curiosity that could shift power in unpredictable ways. But not everyone welcomed that change. A new gladiator arrived vexed, a tall, silver-scaled alien with cold yellow eyes and a reputation as a strategist. He watched Brody during practice, never speaking, just studying. One day he approached flanked by two silent guards. "You're the human who trains with the Beastwoman," he said, voice smooth as oil. "I'd watch my back if I were you. Symbols tend to break under pressure." Brody didn't flinch. "Then maybe you should be careful not to push." Vex didn't respond. He just smiled and walked away, but Brody felt the shift like a knife pressed to the spine. The Colosseum wasn't just a battleground. It was a political stage, and he had just stepped into a game that went far beyond training sessions and fistfights. Later that night, he told Hilda what happened. She didn't seem surprised. Vexed serves the noble caste. He's not just muscle, he's their knife in the dark. If he's watching you, it means they're getting nervous. That means you're doing something right. Brody leaned back against the wall, exhausted but alert. "Then what do we do?" She turned to him, eyes glowing in the low firelight. "We keep fighting. We make them nervous enough to show their hand, and when they do, we make sure we're strong enough to break it." As she lay down beside him on the cold stone floor, tail curling close, Brody didn't feel like prey anymore. He felt like a fuse, slowly burning towards something inevitable, something that would change the Colosseum forever. Dave Vexed issued his challenge. The Colosseum responded like a beast scenting blood. Word spread quickly through the underground cells and sandstone halls. He had requested a formal match, sanctioned by the overseers using an ancient Varkan clause, the right of dominance. It was more than just a fight, it was a declaration. Whoever won would claim rank not just in combat but in status, and Brody's name had been attached in the challenge scroll, not as a fighter, as a prize, a possession, a statement. Brody had expected anger from Hilda, or maybe mockery, but instead she stood quietly, hands behind her back, unreadable as the scroll burned in the pit fire between them. She didn't speak for a long while. The firelight caught her horns and painted shadows across her scarred cheeks, and Brody watched the tension in her jaws slowly settle into something colder than rage. "They want to take you," she said at last. "That's what this is. Not about rank, not about power. They see you as leverage now, and Vexed is their blade." Brody didn't know what to say to that. He'd spent weeks getting tossed into the dirt, bruised and pummeled, but never once had he felt like property. He'd earned his place beside her, bled for it, adapted for it. To have that stripped down to a trophy, it boiled something deep in him he hadn't felt since he first stood trial back on Earth. "Then don't let him win," he said, keeping his voice steady. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, and for the first time he saw real concern behind the feral calm. "This isn't a training match. Vexed is deadly because he doesn't play with his food. He doesn't test or teach. He kills. Fast and efficient. He's never lost in sanctioned combat." "Neither have you," Brody said without hesitation. "And you're not alone." The night before the fight, the air and the Colosseum grew thick. Even the slaves and guards seemed quieter, tension spreading through the tunnels like a disease. Brody sat with Hilda beneath the bone-carved banners of her makeshift quarters, both of them sharpening weapons in silence. He didn't need to be told what was at stake. If she lost, he'd be taken, sold, exploited, maybe executed depending on what Vexed's masters wanted. And Hilda, she'd be humiliated, her influence shattered, her people punished. That weight sat between them like an unspoken vow neither of them could afford to break. Eventually she spoke. "When I first saw you, I thought you were pathetic, weak, soft in all the wrong ways. But now you look me in the eye without fear. You've changed." Brody met her gaze. "You changed me." She leaned closer, her broad shoulders casting a shadow over his, and for a moment there was nothing between them but breath and memory. "If I fall tomorrow, you keep fighting. Don't let them break you. Don't become what they think you are." "You're not going to fall," he said, firm but quiet. "I've seen you fight. I've felt it. You're a storm. He's a knife, sure, but you're a damn avalanche. The next day, the Colosseum filled to bursting. Nobles in silk-draped balconies watched from high above, their alien masks hiding everything but greed. The sand below shimmered with heat, and the stone walls groaned under the weight of the crowds. Brody stood on the edge of the pit, shackled but not kneeling, forced to watch from a pedestal like a trophy on display. But he held his head high, eyes locked on the gate as it opened and Hilda stepped down. She wore no armor, only her blood-red wraps and a set of brass knuckles etched with tribal glyphs. Her fur glistened under the light, and her horns caught the sun like blades. Across from her, Vex emerged in full ceremonial garb, silver-scaled plates that flexed as he moved, twin daggers sheathed at his hips, his gaze calm and focused. He didn't speak as they circled each other. There were no insults, no bravado, just silence, respect maybe, or contempt. It was hard to tell. The gong sounded. Vex's moved first, a blur of motion. He went low, aiming for Hilda's legs, trying to sweep her off balance, but she jumped, twisted, and brought her heel down toward his shoulder. He rolled, deflected the blow with a flash of metal, and sliced upward. Blood splattered across the sand. Hilda grunted, staggered, but didn't fall. Brody's heart pounded in his throat. The crowd cheered, oblivious to the stakes. To them it was entertainment. To him it was everything. Hilda regrouped, then charged. She didn't play cautious now. She unleashed herself. Her fists collided with Vexid's blades in a flurry of sparks and force, and for a while it was impossible to tell who had the upper hand. Vexid was graceful, calculated, every move surgically precise, but Hilda was chaos, raw and relentless. She bled, but she didn't stop. She roared, and the walls seemed to shake. Then it happened. Vexid feinted left, baited a heavy swing, and slipped behind her, dagger raised for a killing blow. Brody's breath caught, but Hilda spun, grabbing his wrist mid-strike and head-butted him with full force. The crack echoed across the Colosseum. Vexid stumbled. She didn't wait. She tackled him, slammed him into the ground, and pinned him beneath her with both knees. The crowd fell silent. "Yield," she growled, voice shaking with fury. Vex spat blood. "Do it. Kill me." But Hilda leaned in, pressing her knuckles against his throat. "No, you don't get to die easy. You get to live knowing you lost to a beast." She stood. The gong rang. The match was over. The crowd erupted. Brody watched, heart racing as she walked to him. The guards made no move to stop her. She reached up and shattered his shackles with a single punch, then grabbed him by the collar and pulled him into a rough embrace, her arms like armor, her breath warm against his cheek. "I told you," she whispered. "Your mine and I don't share." Later, after the Colosseum emptied and the nobles slithered away to plot their next game, Brody and Hilda sat alone in the ring. She was bruised, cut, but smiling. He pressed a cloth to her side and said nothing for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was simple. "I thought he had you." She leaned back on her elbows, eyes half-lidded. "So did I. But then I remembered why I fight, and who I fight for." Brody met her gaze. "And what now? They won't stop." "No," she said, wrapping her tail lazily around his ankle. "They won't, which is why we start planning. No more reacting. We make the next move." And as the torches flickered above them and the stars blinked awake in the alien sky, Brody realized something had changed, not just between them, but in the air around the Colosseum. Something had shifted. Power, momentum, purpose. The Beastwoman Gladiator and her human were no longer curiosities. They were a threat, and the universe was beginning to notice. Brody didn't expect the ambush. Not so soon, not so clean. It happened after dusk, deep in the tunnels beneath the Colosseum where the firelight from the braziers faded and the guards grew lazy with drink. He was returning from a supply run, medical cloth, nothing more, when two figures stepped out of the shadows without a sound. Varkun enforcers, their faces hidden beneath bone-plated masks, their weapons already drawn. Brody barely had time to duck before a baton cracked against the stone wall beside his head. He lashed out, instinct driving him now, the weeks of training under Hilda's brutal hand finally carving their way into muscle memory. He struck low, rolled through the sand, dodged the first, but the second caught him in the ribs and drove him to the ground. Another strike followed, this time across the back of the neck, and stars filled his vision before everything went black. When he woke, the light was different. Artificial, cold, no torches, no flame, just the pale blue glow of energy grids humming through the walls. He was in a holding cell, but not like the Gladiator cages, cleaner, sharper. This was the noble wing, the domain of the overseers and those who ran the blood games from behind curtains of velvet and gold. His wrists were bound with magnetized cuffs and the floor vibrated beneath him like the cell was mounted on an engine. As he adjusted to the light, he realized the walls weren't stone. They were glass. One-way glass, someone was watching. The door hissed open without ceremony, and two more enforcers stepped aside for a third figure, tall, robed in layers of silky black with a voice that oozed like oil. "You've become quite the fascination," the figure said, stepping into the room with measured elegance. "A human, a slave, and now a symbol. You've gone far in such little time. Too far." Brody stared at him, eyes narrowing. "What do you want?" The man chuckled. "You misunderstand. This isn't a negotiation. This is a recalibration. You see, the games need structure, drama, and your involvement with the Beastwoman disrupts that balance. It makes the audience ask questions, makes other slaves hope. We can't have that." Brody pulled at the cuffs, but they didn't budge. "You're scared," he said. "That's why you're hiding behind glass instead of facing me in the pit." The man didn't flinch. "No, but she will. You'll be released. Quietly, bruised, publicly, and when she sees what we've done to you, she'll respond, she'll lash out, and when she breaks the rules, we'll break her." It hit him. Then he wasn't the target. He was the matchstick. They wanted her gone, but they couldn't just kill her. She was too popular, too visible, so they'd provoke her, hurt her through him, manipulate her into rebellion, and then justify her execution as righteous order. His stomach twisted. "You think she'll fall for it?" he asked, teeth clenched. "We don't need her to fall for anything. We need her to act. That's what beasts do." The enforcers dragged him back to the Colosseum at dawn, dumped him in the middle of the pit like a bag of trash. No one dared stop them. The crowd hadn't gathered yet, and only a few other fighters bore witness. Hilda wasn't among them. He lay there, face bloodied, ribs screaming until hands reached down and lifted him. Gentle but firm, familiar. She didn't speak right away, just carried him, cradled against her chest into her chamber like a wounded cub. She laid him on the furs, pulled water to his lips, and waited until his breathing steadied. Then her voice, soft and trembling with the kind of rage only silence can sharpen, filled the space between them. "Who did this?" Brody swallowed blood before answering. "The nobles. They want you to retaliate. They want a reason to kill you publicly." She stood, packing like a caged predator, claws flexing. Her tail lashed behind her, scattering bowls and weapons. "They touched what's mine. That's not politics anymore. That's a challenge." "You can't give them what they want," he said, forcing himself upright despite the pain. "If you attack them, it's over. No trial, no redemption arc. They'll call it savage rebellion and paint you as proof that your kind can't lead." She turned to him, breathing hard, the glow in her eyes flickering like embers. "Then what do you suggest? I let this pass. Let them beat you and walk away laughing." "No," he said, eyes locked with hers. "You outsmart them, you fight, but not the way they expect. You strike in a way they can't trace. You turn their rules against them." Her breathing slowed. Her eyes narrowed, not with rage, but thought. Then slowly, a grin crept across her face, sharp and dangerous. "You think like prey, but you plan like a predator." She moved then, fast and focused, gathering supplies, whispering to trusted allies. Fighters loyal to her cause, those whose people depended on her victories, gathered in the corners of the chamber. Maps were unrolled, guard rotations were discussed. Supply tunnels that ran under the noble wing were identified. Brody lay back against the wall, bandaged but alert, watching her command the room not with fear but with presence, authority. She didn't roar orders. She gave them with calm certainty, and everyone followed. That night, a small explosion rocked the outer wall of the noble quarters. It wasn't enough to hurt anyone, but enough to draw attention. While the guards scrambled to investigate, 3 fighters slipped through the service ducts and delivered a message, scorched into bone and left on the main banquet table. It read, "You touched what is hers. There will be a reckoning." The nobles responded with silence. No public punishment, no declarations, but the arena patrols doubled. The food rations were cut, the infirmary was locked down. The overseers knew a war was brewing, but they didn't know where it would strike. Back in their quarters, Brody sat across from Hilda, both of them sharing a meal in tense quiet. She tore meat from the bone and handed him the larger portion. When he raised a brow, she shrugged. Warriors feed their mates first. He paused, the words hanging in the air longer than either of them seemed ready for. "Is that what I am?" he asked carefully. She didn't answer at first. She leaned closer, her forehead nearly touching his, and whispered, "You're more than that. You're the reason I haven't lost myself, and I won't lose you again." The fire crackled nearby, casting flickering shadows on the fur-lined walls. Outside, the Colosseum was preparing for its next show, but inside, something far more powerful was forming. Not just a rebellion, not just a bond, but a promise. One forged in blood, pain, and defiance. And Brody knew, as her hand closed over his and her tail curled loosely around his leg, that whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. The announcement came 2 days later, carved into the Colosseum wall with ceremonial blades and painted over in golden ink. Brody was to fight, solo, a sanctioned public match against an opponent yet to be named, scheduled at peak hour when the stands would be filled with nobles, mercenaries, and delegates from the other moon sectors. Hilda read it with her arms folded and jaw tight, eyes flicking over the declaration without expression. Brody stood beside her, shoulders squared even as dread settled in his gut like lead. This wasn't just punishment or spectacle, it was a setup, a performance designed to fracture them publicly. If he died, Hilda would be forced to swallow it or snap. If he lived, the system would be undermined by the sight of a human prevailing alone. "They want to break the illusion," she said, voice low, controlled. "They want to make you look weak without me. They want the crowd to watch you crawl, so the idea of you as anything more dies with the fight." He nodded slowly, taking it in. "Then I have to win." "You're not ready," she said, her eyes turning to him with something far closer to concern than doubt. "Not for a sanctioned bout, not alone." "I wasn't ready the first time you slammed me into the dirt," he replied, keeping his voice steady, "but I learned because of you." She didn't argue, but her silence spoke volumes. That night their training changed. No more soft blows or teaching moments. Hilda hit hard fast without warning. Every mistake ended with him sprawled in the dirt, breathless, groaning. Every success earned only a nod. He bled, bruised, strained muscles he didn't know existed. She drilled him on footwork, feints, and recovery. Made him fight blindfolded, made him spar with weight strapped to his wrists. No more teacher and student. Now they were forging a weapon together, something lean, desperate, unpredictable. Between sessions he studied, observed every known combatant still in rotation, the betting logs, their moves, their mistakes. He paid attention to the crowd reactions to what they cheered, what made them lean in. He wouldn't just survive this match. He'd control the narrative, turn their theater into a message. The day arrived fast, too fast. The gates opened to a tide of sound so loud it felt physical. Brody stepped into the arena wearing only light armor, loose enough to keep him moving, tight enough to show the bruises he hadn't bothered hiding. The crowd jeered, some laughed, others whispered, a few pointed. The fragile myth of the human who fought beside the Beastwoman was about to be tested in the most brutal fashion. His opponent entered with ceremony. A four-armed brute from the blood moons, skin plated with natural bone armor, wielding two massive cleavers. A killer with more executions than anyone alive. Brody swallowed his fear and steadied his breathing. No retreat, no hesitation. The gong rang. The first clash rattled him to the core. The brute moved like a freight train faster than expected. Brody dodged barely. He didn't try to match strength. He couldn't. He kept moving, baiting swings, slipping under using angles. His strikes were quick elbows, knees, palms to pressure points. He wasn't here to dominate. He was here to survive long enough to outthink. The crowd started to shift from mocking to murmuring. Every time he dodged by inches or rolled away at the last second, they leaned forward, not cheering, watching. He landed his first clean strike 6 minutes in, an upward elbow to the beast's throat. It staggered, not much, but enough. He kept pressing, stay moving, stay sharp. Then he made a mistake, a misstep. One cleaver caught his shoulder, slicing open skin and sending him spinning. He hit the ground hard. The breath knocked out of him. Blood poured fast. He felt the heat spike, the roaring from the crowd surge. The brute lumbered forward, towering above him, cleavers raised. Brody rolled, kicked up sand, moved behind and grabbed the one weapon he had planted earlier. Hidden under the arena dust, a small dagger disguised as debris. He'd stashed it hours before the match when no one was looking. He jabbed it into the brute's knee joint. The creature roared and buckled. Brody was on him immediately, climbing his back, driving his fist into the base of the skull with everything he had. 1 hit, 2, 3. He didn't stop until the brute collapsed, face first, shaking the sand like a small quake. Silence followed. Then the gong, then the eruption. He stood bloodied, barely upright, chest heaving, but alive, victorious, and the crowd, as if awakened from a trance, began to chant his name, first in confusion, then in awe, not all, but enough. Up in the high box, the overseer sat still, lips tight behind masks, unmoving. Hilda met him in the tunnel, eyes locked on his as he stumbled forward. She didn't say anything, just pulled him into her arms, crushed him against her chest, her claws pressing gently into his back. He felt her tremble, not in fear, but in rage held back by sheer will. "You did it," she whispered. "You proved them wrong." "No," he whispered back. "We did." That night they didn't sleep. They stayed in the training chamber surrounded by furs and steel and the scent of blood. He sat with her, head resting against her thigh as she gently combed fingers through his hair. Her touch was surprisingly soft for someone who could break bone with a flick of her wrist. But here alone she was just Hilda, not a symbol, not a beast, just the woman who chose to fight, not because she loved war, but because no one else would carry the burden. "I know what comes next," she said quietly. "They won't let this stand." "I'm counting on it," Brody said. "We're going to use this win. You've already got the fighters. I've got the spotlight. We push now before they bury it." She looked down at him, glowing eyes unreadable. "You really want to start a war?" "No," he replied. "But they already did. I just want to finish it." And with that, a silent understanding settled between them. No more training, no more waiting. The moment had arrived to pull the system apart from within, and this time, the Beastwoman wouldn't fight alone. The energy across the Colosseum shifted in the days following Brody's victory. Whispers filled the air like smoke, quiet, curling, impossible to contain. For the first time, the crowds murmured about a human not as prey, not as novelty, but as contender. Some called it luck. Others swore they saw something more, something calculated in the way he moved, and how he stood after the fight, bloodied but proud. Even the guards had grown cautious. Brody felt it in the way they no longer shoved him aside or sneered openly when he passed, and when he walked beside Hilda now, there was silence, not from fear, but respect. The two of them together had become something more than spectacle. They had become a symbol, a question the Colosseum didn't know how to answer. Hilda didn't celebrate. She trained harder, pushed herself and her loyal fighters to their limits, Every day, new faces joined their side, former rivals, disillusioned veterans, even a few guards who remembered what the world was like before the overseers turned it into a blood economy. She didn't promise freedom. She didn't talk of hope or dreams. She only offered strength, strategy, and one brutal truth. No one was coming to save them. They would have to break the cage themselves. Brody focused on the other side of the rebellion. He studied the nobles, their patterns, the cracks in their control. He listened to gossip from slaves and engineers, memorized the routines of the overseer's personal guards, watched how the weapons were stored, how the food was moved, where the drones were blind. He was no longer just a fighter. He was the strategist, the one who could weave through systems, turn the very structure of the Colosseum against itself. Hilda fought with fists and fury. Brody fought with blueprints and timing. Their plan took shape in whispers and hand signals. On the final day of the blood cycle, a day of games and celebration, when the crowd would be largest, they would strike, not to escape, but to dismantle the arena from the inside out. Not just to flee, but to end it, so no more would be fed to the sand for the amusement of those who had never bled. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about ending the system. But the overseers were not fools. They sensed something brewing. The matches shifted. Suddenly, Hilda was removed from the roster. Brody's name stopped appearing entirely. Instead, new fighters were brought in. Outsiders, killers from other systems. It was a message. They were being isolated, cut from the game board, forced to watch as the Colosseum returned to business as usual, as if trying to erase their momentum. Then the curfews began. Training times were reduced. Access to the supply tunnels was restricted. Every corridor filled with new guards. Their allies disappeared one by one. Some reassigned. Others executed quietly. The overseers weren't waiting to be attacked. They were tightening the noose. Hilda's rage simmered. Not hot, cold, focused. She didn't scream or lash out. She doubled down. Their new plan became one of necessity, not statement. They would strike before they were erased. One last move, one final escalation, and the entire system would come down with them if it had to. On the night before the plan uprising, Hilda and Brody sat beneath the hanging bones of the old champions. The chamber was quiet, lit only by a single flickering lantern. She sat beside him, legs stretched, arms wrapped loosely around her knees. Her fur was damp from training. Her horns nicked from a scuffle with a guard who had dared to provoke her earlier. Brody leaned back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, exhaustion crawling under his skin. He hadn't slept in a full cycle, not truly. There had been too many details, too many variables to track. "Are we ready?" he asked finally, voice raw. Hilda didn't answer right away. When she did, it wasn't the answer he expected. "I hate this place," she said quietly. "I hate what it made me become, what I had to become to survive. But if I had to do it again, knowing I'd meet you at the bottom of this pit, I would." Brody turned his head, heart tightening in his chest. That sounds dangerously close to romance. Her lips twitched into something close to a smile. "Don't get soft on me now." He reached over and took her hand, rough against his butt, warm. "Just don't die tomorrow." "You either," she said, and squeezed once before standing. "We go when the fires reach the South Tower. That's our window. If we miss it, they'll shut the gates permanently." They didn't sleep that night. Their fighters moved into position, weapons hidden in water barrels, explosives buried beneath the sand. The slave pens were rigged to unlock with a signal torch. Everyone was waiting. Everyone was silent. Then it happened. A fireball lit up the southern sky, and the arena gasped as flames danced above the noble wing. Screams followed, panic. Drones dropped from the rafters, guards scattered to respond. Hilda was the first to move, slamming through the main gate with 3 of her most trusted warriors. Brody moved with the second wave, racing toward the communications room, where the transmission beacons could be hijacked. If they could get a message off-world, they could broadcast everything. Proof of the executions, the slave trades, the experiments done to prisoners too broken to fight. Chaos erupted across the Colosseum. The crowd scattered. Some cheered, Some ran, others fought. Drunk off the bloodlust turned real. The arena had always been a stage. Now it was a battlefield. Brody reached the control wing just as the alarms blared. He slid under a blast shot, knocked one guard unconscious with a stolen baton, and hacked into the terminal with trembling fingers. Hilda was fighting in the center of the pit now, surrounded, her hands soaked in blood, her eyes wild. But she wasn't falling. Every strike she took, she returned twice as hard. Every time someone tried to corner her, she tore through them like a living storm. Then the main gates opened, and what came through was worse than expected. Vexed returned, alive, reconstructed, half-machine now, fused with tech from the Overseer's labs. They had brought him back as their final card, not just to kill Hilda, but to break her legacy. Brody saw him from the tower and froze. Hilda didn't. She charged, and the final reckoning began. The sound of Hilda's roar tore through the chaos like a thunderclap, louder than the alarms, louder than the fire roaring through the southern gates, louder than the panicked nobles screaming from their high balconies. She didn't hesitate. She didn't flinch. She charged straight for Vexed, her body a blur of scarred muscle and rage, each footfall sinking deep into the sand with purpose. And yet what came to meet her was no longer just a rival. The Vex she had defeated weeks ago was gone. In his place stood a twisted version, metal fused with flesh, his arms replaced by serrated blades, his eyes dull and electric, his voice gone silent as the machines controlling him now did the thinking. The Overseers had turned him into something else, not a fighter, a weapon, their final puppet. They met at the center of the arena in a collision that rattled the ground. Sparks and blood flew as claw met steel. Hilda ducked the first strike, rolled under the second, and came up with a brutal elbow to Vexed's side. It didn't slow him. He spun with mechanical speed, catching her across the ribs, sending her flying backward into the stone barrier. She hit hard but didn't stay down. She never stayed down. Brody saw it all from the tower, his hands flying over the control board, sweat stinging his eyes. He'd already disabled the camera filters. The signal was open, the feed broadcasting across the sector, every screen, every tablet, every noble's private suite. They were all watching now. And what they saw wasn't a war. It was justice erupting from the cracks of a rotted empire. Hilda fall back. He shouted through the communicator, hoping the short-range signal would reach her. He's not alive. He's wired. He'll never stop. She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked briefly toward the tower, just enough to let him know she heard. Then she bared her teeth and launched herself back at Vexed. If the Overseers wanted a show, she'd give them one they'd never forget. The arena burned around them. Rebels overran the corridors, freeing prisoners and cutting down guards. Some of the enslaved fighters grabbed weapons and joined the revolt. Others fled into the tunnels. Drones dropped like flies as hidden explosives Brody and Hilda's allies planted days ago detonated in synchronized waves, carving open the walls, shredding the infrastructure. Everything was crumbling, and still the two champions fought. Vexed's movements were unnatural, too smooth, too calculated. He fought without pause, without breath, like a machine only meant for death. Hilda fought with fire, with fury, using every ounce of her body not just to survive, but to dominate. She broke through his guard, shattered one of his metal arms, and got in close enough to slam him to the ground. But instead of staying down, he lashed out with a blade from his spine, stabbing her across the shoulder, ripping flesh. She screamed, blood pouring freely. The crowd above gasped. Some even cheered, unable to let go of the spectacle. Brody couldn't watch anymore. He left the console and raced for the arena floor, weapon in hand. Not to rescue her, he knew better than to think she needed saving, but to fight beside her. If Vexed wouldn't fall, then maybe together they could break the thing he'd become. Hilda had forced Vexed back to his knees when Brody reached the ring. She looked up, her chest heaving, her arm barely lifting from the wound. "Stay back," she growled. Brody ignored her. "You told me not to hesitate. I'm not going to start now." Vexed rose again, mechanical joints hissing, mouth split in a grin that didn't reach his eyes. He lunged at Brody first, faster than either of them expected. Brody dodged the killing stroke, rolled beneath the swing, and stabbed his blade into the exposed joint at Vexed's knee. The creature screamed, not from pain, but from system overload. It was enough. Hilda surged forward, grabbed the base of Vexed's spine, and with a roar that echoed off the broken walls, ripped the metallic core from his back with both hands. Vexed collapsed, twitching, done. The arena went still. Smoke rose from the ruined towers. Fighters and rebels stood in stunned silence. The audience, what remained of them, was trapped behind sealed gates. The overseers, once gods behind curtains, had gone quiet. Brody fell to one knee, chest burning, vision blurred. Hilda dropped beside him, her breathing ragged, her entire body trembling from the effort. He turned to her, took her hand, and pulled her close until their foreheads touched. "It's over," he whispered. "No," she said, a faint grin tugging at her lips. "Now we build something better." They stood together as the fighters gathered, looking to them for what came next. There was no ceremony, no speech. Hilda simply raised her arm and pointed toward the overseer's tower. "Take it," she said. "No more cages, no more blood for sport." The crowd roared, not in madness, not in bloodlust, but in freedom. They surged forward, and within minutes the tower was overrun. The overseers fell, not with fanfare, but with barely a sound. Cowards to the end, they died in their silks, their systems destroyed from within. The rebellion became a revolution. The Colosseum was no longer a prison. It was theirs now. That night, as the fires finally dimmed and the wounded were tended to, Brody and Hilda sat by the great pit, watching the stars return through the shattered dome above. She had her arm around him, her body warm despite the open wounds, her tail wrapped lazily around his leg. "You think they'll come?" Brody asked. "The other systems, they won't ignore this." "They'll come," Hilda said. "But we'll be ready. We won't be alone." He nodded. "We showed them something today." She glanced at him. "We showed them what happens when a human and a Beastwoman fight together." He smirked. "They'll write poems about you." She leaned in, her nose brushing his cheek. "About us." And when she kissed him, rough, fierce, full of blood and fire, he kissed her back with everything he had left. Because what they had now wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning. The morning after the uprising brought a strange kind of quiet to the Colosseum, one that felt unnatural after so much chaos. The screams were gone, the drum beats silenced. Even the wind through the cracked arches above seemed hesitant to move, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Brody walked through the sand-stained corridors, now littered with broken chains, shattered helmets and banners ripped from the walls. Everywhere he looked, fighters were helping one another, stacking supplies, tending wounds, reclaiming spaces that had been theirs in name but never in dignity. The air still smelled of ash, blood, and something else possibility. Not quite peace, but the hint of it. He found Hilda in what had once been the overseer's main hall, a towering chamber lined with stone pillars and gilded observation seats. She was sitting in one of them now, slouched sideways, one leg draped over the armrest, a cup of water in her clawed hand, her reddish fur bandaged at the shoulder where Vex had torn into her. A group of fighters stood around a makeshift table in the center, mapping out the surrounding districts with salvaged datapads and outdated trade maps. Hilda wasn't speaking, just listening, her glowing orange eyes fixed on everything and everyone. Even bruised and bloody, she looked like she'd always belonged in that seat, not because it made her comfortable, but because no one else could fill it. Brody stepped in and waited until she looked his way. She raised her cup in greeting and motioned for him to join her. He climbed the steps and sat beside her without speaking, and they watched the room together for a long moment. "They're organizing fast," he said eventually, nodding toward the fighters' turn council. "They've been waiting for something like this," Hilda replied. "It wasn't about me. It was about what we proved together." "You gave them a reason to fight," Brody said, "and you survived doing it. That changes things." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I almost didn't, if you hadn't stabbed Vex when you did." Brody shrugged. You'd have found another way. She smirked, then looked away. I'm not invincible. That's the point. The council broke into smaller groups, dispersing to carry out their new roles, one to set up a perimeter, another to control access to food and water, others to find out how many fighters were still unaccounted for. The structure was forming fast, and Hilda let them do it. She wasn't barking orders anymore. She was watching, evaluating, deciding who could lead when she wasn't there. I've been thinking, she said suddenly, her tone quieter, about what happens next. Brody tilted his head. You mean after rebuilding this place? No, she said. After us. He blinked. What do you mean? I'm not meant to sit in a chair, Brody, she said, her voice low. I can lead, yes. I can fight. But this isn't my endgame. I'm a warrior. I feel it in my bones. I wasn't made for politics and supply chains. Then don't do it alone, he said. Let them run the daily stuff. You guide the purpose. That's what you've always done. You don't need to stay in the pit to have power. She gave him a long look, one filled with both affection and conflict. And you, I stay with you, he said, without hesitation. Wherever that ends up. The words landed between them with weight, not because they were new, but because they were real, unchanged by blood or glory. She leaned toward him, resting her forehead against his, breathing deep. You always say the right thing. Even when I want to push you away, you stay. He didn't pull back. Because I know you'd never let me fall. A runner entered the room, breathless, interrupting the moment. We've got a visitor, she said, from the outer mining colonies. They came with weapons and a flag. Hilda stood, and so did Brody. They followed the runner through the halls to the main gate, where a rough-looking group stood waiting with packs slung across their backs and pulse rifles strapped to their chests. The one at the front, a tall woman with cybernetic implants tracing her scalp, held up a cloth banner stitched with red and gold. We saw the broadcast, she said. Saw what you did to the overseers. We brought what we could, not just weapons, fighters, supplies, and engineers. Hilda nodded once. You're welcome here, but you fight under our terms. No lords, no arenas, no blood for sport. The woman grinned. We didn't come to play nobles. We came to end them. The alliance was sealed with a clasped handshake, and the banner was raised above the arena gates. More would come. Hilda knew it. Brody felt it too. This was the spark. The Colosseum was no longer a prison. It was a beacon. That night they returned to their shared quarters, now stripped of chains and guards. The space felt warmer, not just from the firelight, but from the sense of belonging. Hilda collapsed onto the furs, groaning as she eased her wounded arm to the side. Brody joined her, laying beside her, letting the exhaustion wash over him. We did it, he murmured, barely awake. We're not done, she replied, but her voice had softened. But for tonight, we rest. She curled her arm around him, her thick tail wrapping over his legs. The fire flickered low, casting shadows along the stone walls. Outside, voices laughed, sang, shared stories. Inside, there was only breath, warmth, and the heartbeat of something new growing in the ruins of the old. As sleep pulled him under, Brody reached for her hand and held it tight. He didn't need words, they said enough. And tomorrow would come soon enough. The seasons on Varkan didn't change in the traditional sense. There were no blossoms or falling leaves, no shift in weather to signal time passing, but you could feel it in the wind, less bitter now, more alive, and in the people who walked the corridors of the Colosseum with heads higher and back straighter. Weeks had passed since the uprising, and though the rebuilding was slow and the scars still fresh, something had changed for good. The Colosseum no longer echoed with forced cheers or the cries of the condemned. It had become a meeting ground, a council chamber, a home. The blood-soaked sand had been swept away, replaced with flat stone and hand-forged steel benches where survivors gathered to make decisions instead of dying for entertainment. What had been a stage for death had become a cradle for something entirely new, unity. Brody stood in the center of what was once the main arena, watching a group of young trainees spar under the guidance of an older Beastman warrior who had once fought for coin. Now he trained others to fight for something real. The kids moved with purpose, eyes sharp, laughter bubbling up between strikes. Brody smiled faintly, arms crossed over his chest, a fine layer of dust clinging to his clothes. He had been busy these last weeks, helping establish the first trade routes with outer settlements, setting up medical stations and coordinating defenses in case the nobles from the other systems decided to retaliate. He was no longer a prisoner, no longer an outlier. He was part of something bigger, and though the days were long and often hard, he welcomed every one of them. He turned as he heard footsteps approaching, heavy but confident, a sound he would recognize anywhere. Hilda came into view, wrapped in a leather-slashed tunic, her battle scars exposed with pride, her horns freshly polished and her expression warm. She moved with the same raw power that had once flattened him in the pit, but now she used it for rebuilding walls, not breaking bones. She reached him, and without a word, slid her arms around his waist, resting her chin against his shoulder with a sigh. "Council wants to name the settlement," she murmured. "They're arguing about calling it Freehold or New Varkun. I told them I didn't care what they called it, so long as no one puts up a damn throne." Brody chuckled, wrapping his arms around her. "We should call it something simple, like home." Hilda grunted, amused, too soft. "Then call it what you like," he said, "as long as I get to stay in it with you." She pulled back just enough to look at him, her orange eyes softer than he ever thought they could be. "You really mean that? After all this, after everything we've seen, everything we've fought through, you'd stay here?" Brody nodded, no hesitation. "I came here a prisoner, then I was a pawn, then a fighter, and somewhere in the middle of all that, I found something better than freedom. I found you." She narrowed her eyes slightly, teasing. "Is this you trying to be romantic again?" He grinned. "I'm not trying." She kissed him before he could say another word, one hand threading through his hair, her body pressing close in a way that left no room for doubt. It wasn't the desperate heat-hub battle passion from the rebellion. It was something deeper, slower, a kiss that said they had time now, that the war was over and something better had taken its place. When they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. "I used to think strength meant standing alone. Now I know better. I'm stronger with you beside me." "Always," he said, voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere." They stayed like that for a long moment, just holding each other while the sounds of rebuilding and laughter rose around them. When they finally walked back through the Colosseum's halls, they passed murals being painted on the walls, depictions of the uprising of Vex's defeat, of Hilda and Brody standing back to back in the sand. He shook his head at the sight. "You know they're making legends out of us, right?" She smirked. "Let them. But if they make my horns smaller in that painting, I'll rip it down myself." At the far end of the hall, a feast was being set up, rough but cheerful, fresh cooked meat, alien root vegetables, and clinking cups of home-brewed spirits. Fighters from a dozen species sat side by side, laughing, toasting, living. Brody and Hilda stepped into the noise, greeted with cheers and pats on the back, not as rulers or leaders but as something far rarer, equals. As night fell and stars pierced the sky above the broken dome, Hilda pulled Brody up onto the center platform, where the overseers once gave their speeches. Now there were no speeches, only moments. She lifted her cup and the crowd quieted. "We tore this place down to build something better," she said, "and we did it together, not with chains, not with fear, but with trust. And now we protect what we've built, not because we have to, but because it's ours." The crowd roared in approval, and Brody raised his cup beside her, his hand brushing hers. They didn't need to say more. Later, when the fire pits burned low and the crowd were you, for this, for us. She rested her headling over the place where it all began. The stars above them burned brighter than ever, no longer hidden by smoke or illusion. Brody leaned against her, his body finally allowed to rest, and for the first time in a long time he felt peace. "Do you miss the fight?" she asked softly. Not the kind we had to survive, he replied. But I'll always fight for you. For this. For us. She rested her head against his. That's all I need to hear. And in the ruins of the old world, surrounded by the beginning of something better, they sat side by side, no longer beast and human, no longer champion and prisoner, but partners, lovers, equals, together until the stars faded.